All right, next we're going to look at the effects of an increase in the money supply. So ask yourself this, and hopefully you'll be able to answer these questions at the end of this section. What if hundreds of millions of dollars in freshly printed bills just dropped out of the sky from a helicopter? Interesting scenario. People pick up the money and put it in their pockets, but how do they dispose of this new money, right? Well, if you're like me or pretty much anybody else, you'd be rushing to grab as much as you could, and then you'd go out and more than likely spend it, or you'd put it into a bank. But in any case, this is kind of, in a sense, what it's like when the Fed increases the supply of money. All right, so there's going to be, first of all, a direct effect. Aggregate demand would go up, right? Just like I said, you'd more than likely go out and spend this money, and that would increase aggregate demand because your disposable income has gone up, right? So basically, with an increase in the money supply, at any given price level, people now want to purchase more real goods and services. Okay, so again, this is an increase in aggregate demand. That's the direct effect. But there's also some indirect effects. So like I mentioned, not everybody's necessarily going to spend this money on goods and services. Some of it's going to get deposited at banks. And when that happens, those banks have higher reserves. And they end up lending out the excess reserves, right? So recall all this from the last chapter, chapter 15. Okay, so those are the indirect effects. Now, banks lower rates, interest rates, to induce this borrowing. They've got this extra cash sitting around. They want to lend it out, and in order to incentivize people to borrow it from them, they have to lower interest rates, right? Charge a lower interest rate for borrowing money. And so what does this do indirectly? Well, businesses borrow that money and engage in investment, right? Individuals end up consuming more durable goods, such as buying homes and cars and trucks and things of that nature. And then further, increased loans generate a further increase in aggregate demand. So not only did we have the direct increase in aggregate demand from people wanting to spend more, purchase more goods and services, but also we have this indirect increase in aggregate demand that's coming as a result of the increase in loanable funds and the decrease in interest rates. So more people, even those that didn't necessarily get any money from the helicopter drop, are involved in spending more money. All right, so what we just saw is that the Fed can boost aggregate demand by increasing the money supply. Now, one of the ways that it increased the money supply in recent history that it hadn't done prior to the Great Recession was through something called quantitative easing. And so this is simply open market purchases that are intended to generate an increase in bank reserves when interest rates are already close to zero. And the way that they accomplished this was, for the first time in history, they started buying things other than government securities, other than bonds. So for the first time in history, they actually bought mortgage-backed securities. So these are securities that are composed of people's mortgages. And right now, they're actually even considering buying stock, which is completely unprecedented. But this is what quantitative easing is. It's unprecedented or atypical measures for increasing banks' reserves while interest rates are already very low. Okay, so let's go through an exercise here thinking about our Keynesian model and the economy when perhaps it's not at full employment. So assume the economy is operating at less than full employment, so we have a recessionary gap. As it turns out, expansionary monetary policy can close that recessionary gap, right? Again, the Fed can increase the money supply to boost aggregate demand and push us out of the recessionary gap. This is what it currently has been engaged in for the past several months because it is anticipating a large recessionary gap as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So in anticipation of this recessionary gap, they have already, for several months now, been increasing drastically the money supply by several trillion dollars. I think it's $3 or $4 trillion in the past couple of months. And as we saw, that has both direct and indirect effects. So the direct effect is that people have more cash, so they want to buy more goods and services. And then some people save some of that money, put it in the bank. The banks have excess reserves with which they can loan out, right? Which increases investment by businesses. It also increases consumption of durable consumer goods. And this pushes the aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay, so something like this, right? Here we are in a recessionary gap. Something has happened to reduce aggregate demand, such as a pandemic. And in fact, in our case, it's probably way out here. But in any case, we have a recessionary gap as a result of that. So we're in a recession. Well, what can the Fed do? It can increase the money supply. It can it can buy a bunch of bonds. And when it buys those bonds, it takes those bonds from investors and banks and it returns them, gives them cash in return. And that cash is injected into the money supply in the economy. And that increases aggregate demand and hopefully pushes us back to our long-run equilibrium where we are at full employment. Okay, what about the opposite case when we're in an inflationary gap and the economy is kind of overheating? Well, the Fed can then engage in contractionary monetary policy to eliminate the inflationary gap, sort of reel in inflation, bring the increase in price level down a bit. And then this is, again, the result of the direct and indirect effects of the change in the money supply, just like we talked about. So there's less money in the economy, so people don't want to buy as many goods and services. So that brings aggregate demand down and to the left. And then it also decreases the amount of reserves that banks have. And so they lend out less money, which indirectly brings down aggregate demand as well. Okay, so in this picture, that's what we see, right? Some sort of scenario that gets us out here into an inflationary gap where the economy is sort of overheating. It's producing at a level above full employment, which pushes up prices. And so the Fed can combat those higher prices by reducing the money supply and bringing aggregate demand down, bringing price levels down as well. Now, what if the Federal Reserve policies generate a higher level of interest rate intended in part to influence bank lending? So a higher level of interest rate will reduce business investment spending, right? If it's more expensive to borrow money, businesses aren't going to make as many investments. And on top of that, households are going to cut back on their consumption of things that they take money, that they borrow money for. So things like cars and houses, right? People typically borrow money for those things. If interest rates go up, it's more expensive to borrow money for those things. And so households are going to cut back on the consumption of those durable goods. And the resulting reduction in planned expenditures generates a decrease in aggregate demand, pulling us out of that inflationary gap. All right, so far we've talked about monetary policy basically in a closed economy. We haven't been considering the fact that we live in a global economy and we trade with other countries. So now we're going to look at monetary policy when it becomes more complex and we think about it in terms of a global economy that's interconnected. All right, so there is a net export effect of contractionary policy. What are the effects of the Fed reducing the money supply? What are the effects of that on net exports? So, as we've already seen, that policy increases interest rates, right? A contractionary monetary policy that reduces the money supply increases interest rates, so it makes it more expensive to borrow money. Well, in turn, the higher interest rates also attract more investment from foreigners because they see that if they invest their money here in the United States, where we have now higher interest rates, they can get more return on their investment. And as a result, the international price of the dollar goes up, right? The dollar becomes stronger as a result of this. And when the dollar becomes stronger, it makes our goods more expensive, right? So another way of saying that the dollar becomes stronger is that we say that it appreciates. It becomes high. It goes higher in value. And this reduces our net exports, right? If our goods get more expensive because the dollar is stronger, then foreigners buy less of our stuff, and we buy more of their stuff because relatively their stuff has now become cheaper, right? And this reduces net exports. And so contractionary policy has a negative effect on net exports. And since net exports is a part of aggregate demand, this contractionary policy also brings down aggregate demand through the net exports portion of aggregate demand. Okay, so to summarize that, contractionary monetary policy reduces the money supply, which causes interest rates to go up. And such an increase in interest rates induces international inflows of funds, right? So China, France, Germany want to bring their money here because we have higher interest rates and they can get more for their investment. And so this basically makes the dollar more valuable when they do that, right? Because in order to invest in this country, they have to change their currency to dollars. The dollar becomes more valuable if they want to make investments here. And when our dollar becomes more valuable, it gets stronger. It also makes our goods more expensive. And so the net export effect of contractionary monetary policy will be in the same direction as the general monetary policy effect that we've seen already. And therefore, it basically amplifies the effect of such a policy. The opposite is true of expansionary policy, right? When the Fed increases the money supply, dropping interest rates. Okay, so at this point now, international companies and persons and businesses want to take their money out of the United States because they're not able to get as high a return on their investment. Interest rates have come down. So they don't want to lend their money to people in the US if they can't get much in return. So they start pulling their money out, right? Now, when they start pulling their money out, that makes their currency more valuable and ours less valuable. And when our currency becomes less valuable, it makes our goods cheaper relative to other countries' goods. And so when our goods become cheaper, foreigners buy more of our stuff. It also means that foreigners' goods become more expensive and we buy less of their stuff. And that has a positive effect on net exports. Net exports goes up. And since net exports, again, is part of aggregate demand also goes up. And so basically that's what happens. Now, every day we're becoming a more and more globalized society throughout the world. What's involved with the globalization of international money markets? So the Fed's ability to control the growth rate of the money supply might be hampered to some degree as U.S. money markets become less isolated. In other words, as we become more internationally connected. Now, if the Fed reduces the growth of the money supply, individuals and firms in the United States can obtain dollars from other sources and can more regularly conduct transactions using other nations' currency. So for many, many decades, the United States has enjoyed being the dominant currency in the world. And so the Fed has really had a lot of power, right? Since our currency is very, very widespread, it's even used in a lot of other countries as their own currency because they tried to have their own currency and it failed for one reason or another. And so they just adopted ours because it's strong and it's stable. That gives the Fed a lot of power because not only can it manipulate our economy, but it can essentially manipulate other economies in the world because of this. But over time, this power is becoming eroded. And so that's basically what we're talking about here in this slide.